Old Path White Clouds. Walking in the Footsteps of the Buddha. Written by Thich Nhat Hanh. Chapter 1. Walking just to walk. Under the shadows of the green bamboo, the young bhikkhu, Svasht, sat cross-legged, concentrating on his breath. He had been meditating for more than an hour in the bamboo forest monastery, while hundreds of other bhikkhus were also practicing under the shade of the bamboo trees or in their own thatched huts. The great teacher Gautama, whom people affectionately called the Buddha, lived in the monastery with nearly 400 disciples. Although crowded, it was very peaceful. 40 acres surrounded the monastery, and many varieties of graceful bamboo from all over Magadha were planted there. Just a 30 minutes walk north of the capital city of Rajagaha, the bamboo forest monastery had been given to Buddha and his community by King Bimbisara 7 years earlier. Svasht rubbed his eyes and smiled. His legs were still tender as he slowly uncrossed them. 21 years old, he had been ordained 3 days earlier by the Venerable Sariputta, one of the Buddha's senior disciples. During the ordination ceremony, Svasht's thick brown hair was shaved off. Svasht was very happy to be part of the Buddha's community. Many bhikkhus were of noble birth, such as the Venerable Nanda, the Buddha's brother, and Devadatta, Anuruddha, and Ananda. Although Svasht had not yet been introduced to these men, he had noticed them from afar. Even in faded robes, their noble bearing was unmistakable. It will be a long time before I can be friends with men of such noble birth, thought Svasht. And yet, even though the Buddha himself was the son of a king, Svasht felt no gulf between them. Svasht was an untouchable, lower than the lowest and poorest caste according to the system of discrimination among the people of India at that time. For more than 10 years, he had tended water buffalo, but for 2 weeks now, he was living and practicing with monks from all castes. Everyone was very kind to him, offering him warm smiles and deep bows, but he did not yet feel at ease. He suspected it might take years before he could feel completely comfortable. Suddenly, a broad smile emerged from deep within him, as he thought of Rahula, the Buddha's 18-year-old son. Rahula had been a novice in the community since the age of 10, and in just 2 weeks Rahula and Svasht had become best friends. It was Rahula who taught Svasht how to follow his breath during meditation. Rahula understood the Buddha's teachings well, even though he was not yet a bhikkhu. He needed to wait until he was 20 before he could receive full ordination. Svasht reflected on the time, just 2 weeks before, when the Buddha came to Uruvela, his small village near Gaya, to invite him to become a monk. When the Buddha arrived at his home, Svasht was out with his brother, Rupak, taking care of the buffaloes. His 2 sisters, Bala, age 16, and Bhima, age 12, were there, and Bala recognized the Buddha right away. She began to run out to find Svasht, but the Buddha told her it wasn't necessary. He said that he and the monks traveling with him, including Rahula, would walk to the river to find her brother. It was late afternoon when they came upon Svasht and Rupak scrubbing down their 9 buffaloes in the Narahara River. As soon as they saw the Buddha, the young men ran up the bank of the river, joined their palms to form a lotus bud, and bowed deeply. "You've grown so much," the Buddha said, smiling warmly at Svasht and his brother. Svasht was speechless. Seeing the Buddha's peaceful face, his warm and generous smile, and his brilliant, penetrating eyes, moved him to tears. The Buddha wore a saffron robe made of patches sewn together in the pattern of a rice field. He still walked barefoot as he had 10 years before, when Svasht first met him not far from this very spot. 10 years before they had spent hours sitting together on the banks of the Narahara and beneath the shade of the Bodhi tree, just 10 minutes walk from the riverbank. Svasht glanced at the 20 bhikkhus behind the Buddha and saw that they, too, were barefoot and clad in patched robes of the same color. Looking more closely, Svasht saw that the Buddha's robe was a hand-length longer than those of the others. Standing next to the Buddha was a novice about Svasht's age who looked at him directly and smiled. Buddha gently placed his hands on Svasht and Rupak's heads and told them he had stopped by to visit on his way back to Rajagaha. He said he would be happy to wait while Svasht and Rupak finished bathing the buffaloes so they could all walk to Svasht's thatched hut together. During the walk back, Buddha introduced Svasht and Rupak to his son Rahula, the young novice who had smiled so beautifully at Svasht. Rahula was 3 years younger than Svasht, but they were the same height. Rahula was a Samanera, a novice, but he dressed much the same as the older Bhikkhu. Rahula walked between Svasht and Rupak, handing his alms bowl to Rupak and placing his arms lovingly around the shoulders of his two new friends. He had heard so much about Svasht and his family from his father that he felt he already knew them. The brothers basked in the warmth of Rahula's love. As soon as they arrived at Svasht's home, the Buddha invited him to join the Bhikkhu community and study the Dharma with him. 10 years earlier, when Svasht had first met the Buddha, he expressed his wish to study with him, and the Buddha had agreed to accept Svasht as a disciple. Now that Svasht was 21, the Buddha had returned. He had not forgotten his promise. Rupak led the buffaloes back to Mr. Rambhu, their owner. The Buddha sat outside Svasht's hut, on a small stool, while the Bhikkhus stood behind him. With earthen walls and a thatched roof, Svasht's tiny home was not large enough for everyone to come inside. Bala told Svasht, "Brother, please go with the Buddha. Rupak is even stronger than you were when you began tending the buffaloes, and I am quite capable of taking care of the house. You have looked after us for 10 years, and now we are ready to be on our own." Sitting next to the rainwater barrel, Bhima looked up at her big sister without saying a word. Svasht looked at Bhima. She was a lovely young girl. When Svasht met the Buddha, Bala was 6 years old, Rupak 3, and Bhima only an infant. Bala cooked for the family while Rupak played in the sand. 6 months following their father's death, their mother passed away in childbirth. Just 11 years old, Svasht became the head of the household. He found a job tending water buffaloes, and because Svasht was a good worker, he earned enough to feed his family. He was even able to bring buffalo milk home for little Bhima. Realizing that Svasht was asking her about her feelings, Bhima smiled. She hesitated a moment and then spoke softly, "Brother, go with the Buddha." She turned her face away to hide the tears. Bhima had heard Svasht mention his wish to study with Buddha so many times and she truly wanted him to go, but now that the moment had arrived, she could not hide her sadness. The Buddha sat outside Svasht's hut, on a small stool. Just then, Rupak returned from the village, and hearing Bhima's words, "Go with the Buddha," he understood that the time had come. He looked at Svasht and said, "Yes, brother, please go with the Buddha," and the whole family fell silent. Rupak looked at the Buddha and said, "Venerable Sir, I hope you will permit my brother to study with you. I am old enough to care for our family." Rupak turned to Svasht and, holding back his tears, said, "But brother, please ask the Buddha if you can come back and visit us from time to time." The Buddha stood up and gently stroked Bhima's hair. "Children, please eat now. Tomorrow morning, I will return for Svasht so we can walk together to Rajagaha. The Bhikkhus and I will rest beneath the Bodhi tree tonight." As the Buddha reached the gate, he looked back at Svasht and said, "Tomorrow morning, you do not need to bring anything. The clothes you are wearing are enough." That night the 4 siblings stayed up late. Like a departing father, Svasht gave them his last advice on taking care of each other and the household. He embraced each of them for a long time. Unable to hold back her tears, little Bhima sobbed while her oldest brother held her. But then she looked up, breathed deeply, and smiled at him. She didn't want Svasht to feel sad. The oil lamp cast a dim light, but it was enough for Svasht to see her smile, and he appreciated it. Early the next morning, Sujata, Svasht's friend, came to say goodbye. The evening before, she had seen the Buddha when she was on her way to the riverbank, and he told her that Svasht would be joining the order of monks. Sujata, the daughter of the village head, was 2 years older than Svasht, and she, too, had met Gautama before he became the Buddha. Sujata gave Svasht a small jar of herbal medicines to take with him. They spoke only briefly, and then the Buddha and his disciples arrived. Svasht's brother and sisters were already awake to see their brother off. Rahula spoke gently to each of them, encouraging them to be strong and to take care of each other. He promised that whenever he was nearby, he would stop in Uruvela to visit them. Svash's family and Sujata walked with the Buddha and the bhikkhus to the riverbank, and there they joined their palms to say goodbye to the Buddha, the monks, Rahula, and Svasht. Svasht was overcome with both fear and joy. There was a knot in his stomach. This was the first time he had ever left Uruvela. The Buddha said it would take 10 days to reach Rajagaha. Most people traveled more quickly, but the Buddha and his bhikkhus walked slowly and with great ease. As Svasht's pace slowed down, his heart quieted. He was wholeheartedly immersing himself in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and this was his path. He turned around for one last glimpse of the only land and people he knew, and he saw Sujata and his family as mere specks merging with the shadows of the forest trees. It seemed to Svasht that the Buddha walked just to enjoy the walking, unconcerned about arriving anywhere at all. So it was with all the bhikkhus. No one seemed anxious or impatient to reach their destination. Each man's steps were slow, balanced, and peaceful. It was as if they were taking a pleasant stroll together. No one ever appeared tired, and yet they covered a good distance each day. Each morning they would stop in the nearest village to beg for food. They walked along the streets in a single line with the Buddha at the head. Svasht came last, just behind Rahula. They walked with quiet dignity, observing each breath and each step. Once in a while, they would stop while villagers placed offerings of food in their bowls. Some villagers knelt by the side of the road in respect. As the bhikkhus received the food, they quietly recited prayers for the people. When they finished begging, they slowly left the village to find a place beneath some trees or in a grassy meadow where they could eat. They sat in a circle and divided the food equally, careful to fill anyone's bowl that was still empty. Rahula filled a jug with water from a nearby stream and respectfully carried it to the Buddha. After the Buddha joined his palms together to form what looked like a lotus flower, Rahula poured the water over the Buddha's hands and rinsed them clean. He did the same for everyone else, coming last to Svasht. As Svasht did not yet have a bowl, Rahula placed half of his own food on a fresh banana leaf and gave it to his new friend. Before eating, the bhikkhus joined their palms and chanted together. Then they ate in silence, mindful of each bite. When they finished, some bhikkhus practiced walking meditation, some did sitting meditation, and others took a short nap. When the hottest part of the day had passed, they took to the road again, and they walked until it was nearly dark. The best places to rest for the night were undisturbed forests, and they walked until they found a good place. Each bhikkhu had his own cushion, and many sat cross-legged in the lotus position for half the night before spreading out their robes and going to sleep. Each bhikkhu carried 2 robes, the one he was wearing and another to use as protection against wind and cold. Svasht sat in meditation like the others and learned to sleep upon the earth using a tree root for a pillow. When Svasht awoke the next morning, he saw the Buddha and many of the bhikkhus already sitting peacefully in meditation, radiating profound calm and majesty. As soon as the sun rose over the horizon, each bhikkhu folded his extra robe, picked up his bowl, and began the day's journey. Walking by day and resting by night, it was 10 days before they reached Rajagaha, the capital of Magadha. It was the first time Svasht had seen a city. Horse carts pressed through streets lined with crowded dwellings, shouts and laughter echoed everywhere. But the silent procession of the bhikkhus continued, as peacefully as when they strolled along the quiet riverbanks or between country rice fields. A few of the city dwellers paused to watch them, and a few, recognizing the Buddha, bowed deeply to show their respect. The bhikkhus continued their calm procession until they reached the bamboo forest monastery, just beyond the city. News spread quickly throughout the monastery that the Buddha had returned, and within moments, nearly 400 bhikkhus gathered to welcome him back. The Buddha did not say much but asked about everyone's well-being and meditation practice. He entrusted Svasht to Sariputta, who was also Rahula's spiritual instructor. Sariputta was the novice master of Bamboo Forest Monastery and watched over the studies of nearly 50 young monks, all of whom had been in the community for less than 3 years. The abbot of the monastery was a monk named Khandana. Rahula was asked to introduce Svasht to the ways of monastery life, how to walk, sit, stand, greet others, do walking and sitting meditation, and observe his breathing. He also showed Svasht how to wear the monk's robe, beg for food, recite prayers, and wash his bowl. For 3 continuous days, Svasht did not leave Rahula's side, so that he could learn these things well. Rahula put his whole heart into instructing Svasht, yet Svasht knew it would take years of practicing before he would be able to do these things in a relaxed and natural way. After this basic instruction, Sariputta invited Svasht into his hut and explained the precepts of a bhikkhu. A bhikkhu was one who left his family in order to follow the Buddha as a teacher, the Dharma as the path which leads to awakening, and the Sangha as the community that supports one along the path. A bhikkhu's life was simple and humble. Begging for food helped foster humility and was also a means to be in contact with others and help them see the way of love and understanding which the Buddha taught. 10 years earlier beneath the Bodhi tree, Svasht and his friends had listened to the Buddha speak about the path of awakening as the path of love and understanding, so it was easy for him to grasp all that Sariputta told him. Though Sariputta's face appeared serious, his eyes and smile radiated great warmth and compassion. He told Svasht that there would be a precept ceremony to formally accept him into the community of bhikkhus, and he taught Svasht the words he would need to recite. Sariputta himself presided over the precept ceremony. About 20 bhikkhus attended. The Buddha and Rahula were there, adding to Svasht's happiness. Sariputta silently recited a gatha, and then shaved off several locks of Svasht's hair. He then gave the razor to Rahula, who completed the task of shaving Svasht's head. Sariputta gave Svasht 3 robes, a bowl, and a water filter. Because he had already been taught by Rahula how to wear the robe, Svasht put it on without difficulty. He bowed before the Buddha and the other bhikkhus present to express his deep gratitude. Later that morning, Svasht practiced begging for the first time as an ordained bhikkhu. The monks of Bamboo Forest Monastery walked into Rajagaha in several small groups, and Svasht was part of the group led by Sariputta. After taking just a few steps out of the monastery, Svasht reminded himself that begging was a vehicle to practice the way. He observed his breathing and took each step quietly and in mindfulness. Rahula walked behind him. Although he was now a bhikkhu, Svasht knew that he had considerably less experience than Rahula. He resolved with all his heart to nurture humility and virtue within himself.
Chapter 2. Chapter 2. Chapter 2. Tending water buffaloes. The day was cool. After eating the noon meal in mindfulness, each bhikkhu washed his own bowl and placed his cushion on the earth to sit facing the Buddha. The many squirrels that lived in bamboo forest mingled freely with the monks, and some climbed up into bamboo trees to gaze down at the gathering. Svasht saw Rahula sitting directly in front of the Buddha, and he quietly tiptoed there and placed his cushion next to Rahula's. They sat together in the lotus position. In that serene and dignified atmosphere, no one spoke. Svasht knew that each bhikkhu was following his breath mindfully, waiting for the Buddha to speak. The Buddha's bamboo platform was high enough for everyone to see him clearly. The Buddha had a relaxed, yet majestic air like that of a lion prince. His eyes filled with loving compassion as he looked out over the assembly. When his eyes came to rest on Svasht and Rahula, the Buddha smiled and began to speak. Today I wish to tell you about the work of tending water buffaloes, what a good buffalo boy must know and what he must be able to do. A boy who cares well for water buffaloes is a boy who easily recognizes each buffalo under his care, knows the characteristics and tendencies of each one, knows how to scrub them, care for their wounds, chase mosquitoes away with smoke, find safe paths for them to walk, love them, find safe and shallow places for them to cross the river, seek fresh grass and water for them, preserve the grazing meadows, and let the older buffaloes serve as good models for the younger ones. Listen, Bhikkhu, just as a buffalo boy recognizes each of his own buffaloes, a bhikkhu recognizes each of the essential elements of his own body. Just as a buffalo boy knows the characteristics and tendencies of each buffalo, a bhikkhu knows which actions of body, speech, and mind are worthy and which are not. Just as a buffalo boy scrubs his animals clean, a bhikkhu must cleanse his mind and body of desires, attachments, anger, and aversions. As he spoke, the Buddha's eyes did not leave Spasht. Spasht felt that he himself was the source of the Buddha's words. He recalled how, years before, while sitting at the Buddha's side, the Buddha would ask him to describe in detail his work of tending water buffaloes. How else could a prince raised in a palace know so much about buffaloes? Though the Buddha spoke in a normal voice, each sound rose clear and distinct and no one missed a word. Just as a buffalo boy cares for his buffalo's wounds, a bhikkhu watches over his six sense organs, eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind, so that they do not become lost in dispersion. Just as a buffalo boy protects his buffaloes from mosquito bites by building fires to create smoke, the bhikkhu uses the teaching of becoming awake to show those around him how to avoid the afflictions of body and mind. Just as the boy finds a safe path for the buffaloes to walk, the bhikkhu avoids those paths that lead to desire for fame, wealth, and sexual pleasure, places such as taverns and theaters. Just as a buffalo boy loves his buffaloes, the bhikkhu cherishes the joy and peace of meditation. As the boy finds a safe, shallow place in the river for the buffaloes to cross, the bhikkhu relies on the Four Noble Truths to negotiate this life. As the boy finds fresh grass and water for his buffaloes, the bhikkhu knows that the four establishments of mindfulness are the nourishment leading to liberation. As the boy preserves the fields by not overgrazing them, the bhikkhu is careful to preserve the relationships with the nearby community as he begs offerings. As the boy lets the older buffaloes serve as models for the younger ones, the bhikkhu depends on the wisdom and experience of their elders. O Bhikkhus, a bhikkhu who follows these 11 points will attain arhatship in the span of 6 years of practice. As a buffalo boy finds fresh grass for his buffaloes, so a bhikkhu knows that the four establishments of mindfulness lead to liberation. Spasht listened in astonishment. The Buddha had remembered everything he had told him 10 years before, and was able to apply each detail to a bhikkhu's practice. Though Spasht knew the Buddha was teaching the entire assembly of monks, he also had the distinct impression that the Buddha was addressing him directly. The young man's eyes did not wander even once from the Buddha's countenance. These were words to hold in one's heart. Of course, there were terms such as 6 sense organs, 4 noble truths, 4 establishments of mindfulness, which Spasht did not yet understand. He would ask Rahula later to explain these terms, but he knew he understood the essential meaning of the Buddha's words. Buddha continued to speak. He told the assembly about choosing a safe path for the buffaloes to walk. If the path was overgrown with thorns, the buffaloes would get cuts which could become infected. If the buffalo boy did not know how to take care of wounds, his buffaloes could become feverish and even die. Practicing the way was the same. If a bhikkhu did not find a proper path, he could become wounded in mind and body. Greed and anger could further poison his wounds until they grew so infected that the way to enlightenment became hindered. The Buddha paused. He motioned for Spasht to come up and stand beside him. Spasht stood with his palms joined while Buddha, smiling, introduced Spasht to the assembly. 10 years ago I met Spasht in the forest near Gaya, just before I realized the way. He was then 11 years old. It was Spasht who gathered armfuls of kusa grass which I used for a cushion to sit beneath the Bodhi tree. Everything I have taught about water buffaloes, I learned from him. I knew he was a good buffalo boy, and I know he will be a fine bhikkhu. Everyone's eyes were on Svasht, and he could feel his ears and cheeks tingling and becoming very red. The men all joined their palms and bowed to him, and he bowed back to them. The Buddha then concluded the Dharma talk by asking Rahula to recite the 16 methods of conscious breathing. Rahula stood, placed his palms together, and recited each method in a voice as bright and clear as a bell. When he finished, he bowed to the community, and the Buddha stood up and slowly walked back to his hut. After he did so, all the monks in the assembly took their own cushions and walked slowly to their own spot in the forest. Some of the monks lived in huts, but many slept and meditated outdoors, beneath the bamboo trees. Only when it rained very hard did they pick up their cushions and seek shelter in the residential huts or lecture halls. Svasht's teacher, Sariputta, had assigned him to share a space outdoors with Rahula. When Rahula was younger, he had to sleep in a hut with the teacher who served as his guardian, but now he had a spot under the trees. Svasht was happy to be with Rahula. Late that afternoon, after sitting meditation, Svasht practiced walking meditation alone. He selected an empty path to avoid encountering others, but he found it difficult to remain concentrated on his breathing. His thoughts were filled with longing for his brother and sisters and the village at home. The image of the path leading to the Narahara river rose clearly in his mind. He saw little Bhima lowering her head to hide her tears and Rupak caring for Ramhu's water buffaloes alone. He tried to chase these images away and focus on nothing but his steps and breathing, but the images continued to flood him. He felt ashamed that he could not devote himself to his practice, and he felt unworthy of the Buddha's trust. After walking meditation, he thought he would ask Rahula for help. There were also several things the Buddha had said in his Dharma talk that morning that he had not fully grasped, and he was sure Rahula could explain them to him. Just thinking about Rahula encouraged and calmed him, and he found it easier to follow his breathing in each slow step. Svasht had not yet had a chance to look for Rahula, when Rahula came looking for him. He led Svasht to a seat beneath a bamboo tree, and said, "This afternoon I met the elder Ananda. He would like to hear all about how you first met the Buddha." "Who is Ananda, Rahula?" "He's a prince of the Sakya line and the Buddha's cousin. He became a monk 7 years ago and now he is one of the best disciples. The Buddha loves him dearly. It is he who looks after the master's health. Ananda has invited us to come to his hut tomorrow evening. I too want to hear all about the time the Buddha was living in the Gaya forest." "Hasn't the Buddha already told you?" "Yes, but not in detail. I'm sure you have a lot of stories to tell." "Well, there isn't really much, but I will tell all I remember." "Rahula, what is Ananda like? I feel a little nervous." "Don't worry. He's very kind and friendly. I told him about you and your family, and he was delighted. Shall we meet in this spot tomorrow morning when we go begging for food? Now I must wash my robe so it will be dry in time." As Rahula stood to leave, Svasht tugged lightly at his robe. "Can you sit for just a while longer? There are some things I want to ask you." This morning the Buddha spoke about 11 points a bhikkhu must follow, but I can't recall all 11. Can you repeat them for me? I can only remember 9 myself. But don't worry, tomorrow we can ask Ananda. Are you sure the elder Ananda will remember all of them? Positive. If it had been 111, Ananda would still remember. You don't know Ananda yet, but everyone here admires his memory. It's incredible. He can repeat flawlessly everything the Buddha has said without leaving out even one tiny detail. Around here, everyone calls him the most learned of all the Buddha's disciples. So whenever someone forgets something the Buddha has said, they seek out Ananda. Sometimes the community organizes study sessions in which Ananda goes over the Buddha's basic teachings. Then we're very lucky. We'll wait and ask him tomorrow. But there is something else I want to ask you. How do you quiet your mind during walking meditation? Do you mean to say that during your walking meditation other thoughts came into your mind? Like thoughts of missing your family? Sposh grasped his friend's hand. How did you know? That's exactly what happened. I don't know why I miss my family so much this evening. I feel terrible, but I don't seem to have enough resolve to practice the way. I feel ashamed before you and the Buddha. Rahula smiled. Don't be ashamed. When I first joined the Buddha, I missed my mother, my grandfather, and my aunt. Many nights I buried my face in my cushion and cried alone. I knew that my mother, grandfather, and aunt missed me, too. But after a while, it was better. Rahula helped Svasht up to a standing position and gave him a friendly hug. Your brother and sisters are lovely. It's only natural for you to miss them, but you'll get used to your new life. We've got lots of work to do here. We must practice and study. But listen, when we get a chance, I'll tell you about my family, all right? Svasht held Rahula's hand in his own two hands and nodded. Then they parted, Rahula to wash his robe and Svasht to find a broom to sweep the paths clear of bamboo leaves.
Chapter 3. An armful of kusa grass. Before falling asleep, Svasht sat beneath a bamboo tree and recalled the months he had first met the Buddha. He was just 11 years old then, and his mother had recently died, leaving him in charge of his 3 younger siblings. His youngest sister, an infant, had no milk to drink. Luckily, a man in the village named Ramphu hired Svasht to tend his water buffaloes, 4 grown buffaloes and 1 calf. And so Svasht was able to milk a buffalo cow every day and feed his baby sister. He tended the water buffaloes with utmost care, for he knew that he had to keep his job or his siblings would starve. Since his father's death, their roof had not been rethatched, and every time it rained, Rupak had to scurry about placing stone jars beneath the gaping holes to catch the rainwater. Bala was only 6 years old but had to learn to cook, care for her baby sister, and gather firewood in the forest. Though just a small child, she could knead flour into chapati bread for her siblings to eat. Rarely could they buy even a bit of curry powder. When Svasht led the buffaloes back to their stable, the tantalizing fragrance of curry drifting from Ramphu's kitchen made his mouth water. Chapati dipped in curry sauce cooked with meat had been an unknown luxury since his father died. The children's clothes were little more than rags. Svasht owned but one worn dhoti. When it was cold he wrapped an old brown cloth around his shoulders. It was threadbare and faded, but precious to him, nonetheless. Svasht had to find good grazing spots for the buffaloes, for if he returned them to their stable hungry, he knew he would be beaten by Mr. Ramphu. In addition, he had to carry home a sizable bundle of grass every evening for the buffaloes to eat throughout the night. On evenings when the mosquitoes were thick, Svasht lit a fire to chase them away with the smoke. Ramphu paid him in rice, flour, and salt every 3 days. Some days, Svasht was able to bring home a few fish that he had caught along the edges of the Naranjara River for Bhima to cook. One afternoon, after he had bathed the buffaloes and cut a bushel of grass, Svasht felt like spending a quiet moment alone in the cool forest. Leaving the buffaloes grazing at the forest's edge, Svasht looked about for a tall tree to rest against. Suddenly he stopped. There was a man sitting silently beneath a pipala tree, no more than 20 feet away. Svasht gazed at him in wonder. He had never before seen anyone sit so beautifully. The man's back was perfectly straight, and his feet rested elegantly upon his thighs. He held himself with utmost stability and inner purpose. His eyes appeared to be half closed, and his folded hands rested lightly on his lap. He wore a faded yellow robe which left one shoulder bare. His body radiated peace, serenity, and majesty. Just one look at him, and Svasht felt wondrously refreshed. His heart trembled. He did not understand how he could feel something so special for a person he hadn't even met, but he stood immobile in utter respect for a long moment. Then the man opened his eyes. He did not see Svasht at first, as he uncrossed his legs and gently massaged his ankles and the soles of his feet. Slowly he stood up and began to walk. Because he walked in the opposite direction, he still did not see Svasht. Without making a sound, Svasht watched the man take slow, meditative steps along the forest floor. After 7 or 8 such steps, the man turned around, and it was then that he noticed Svasht. He smiled at the boy. No one had ever smiled with such gentle tolerance at Svasht before. As though drawn by an invisible force, Svasht ran towards the man, but when he was within a few feet, he stopped in his tracks, remembering that he had no right to approach anyone of higher caste. Svasht was an untouchable. He did not belong to any of the 4 social castes. His father had explained to him that the Brahmana caste was the highest, and people born into this caste were priests and teachers who read and understood the Vedas and other scriptures and made offerings to the gods. When Brahma created the human race, the Brahman issued from his mouth. The Kshatriya were the next highest caste. They could hold political and military positions, as they had issued from Brahma's 2 hands. Those of the Vaisya caste were merchants, farmers, and craftspeople who had sprung from Brahma's thighs. Those of the Sudra caste had come from Brahma's feet and were the lowest of the 4 castes. They did only the manual labor not performed by the higher castes. But Svasht's family members were untouchables, those who had no caste at all. They were required to build their homes outside of the village limits, and they did the lowest kinds of work such as collecting garbage, spreading manure, digging roads, feeding pigs, and tending water buffaloes. Everyone had to accept the caste into which he or she was born. The sacred scriptures taught that happiness was the ability to accept one's position. If an untouchable like Svasht touched a person of a higher caste, he would be beaten. In the village of Uravala, an untouchable man had been beaten severely for touching a Brahman with his hand. A Brahman or Kshatriya touched by an untouchable was considered polluted and had to return home to fast and do penance for several weeks in order to cleanse himself. Whenever Svasht led the buffaloes home, he took great pains not to pass near any person of high caste on the road or outside Rampu's house. It seemed to Svasht that even the buffaloes were more fortunate than he, because a Brahman could touch a buffalo without being polluted. Even if, through no fault of the untouchable, a person of higher caste accidentally brushed against him, the untouchable could still be ruthlessly beaten. Here, before Svasht, stood a most attractive man, and it was clear from his bearing that he did not share the same social status. Surely someone with so kind and tolerant a smile would not beat Svasht even if he did touch him, but Svasht did not want to be the cause of pollution of someone so special, and that was why he froze when he and the man were a few steps apart. Seeing Svasht's hesitation, the man stepped forward himself. Svasht stepped back to avoid coming in contact with the man, but the man was quicker, and in the blink of an eye had grasped Svasht by the shoulder with his left hand. With his right hand, he gave Svasht a tender pat on the head. Svasht stood motionless. No one had ever touched him on the head in so gentle and affectionate way, and yet he felt suddenly panic-stricken. "Don't be afraid, child," the man said in a quiet and reassuring voice. At the sound of that voice, Svasht's fears disappeared. He lifted his head and gazed at the man's kind and tolerant smile. After hesitating for a moment, he stammered, "Sir, I like you very much." The man lifted Svasht's chin in his hand and looked into the boy's eyes. "And I like you also. Do you live nearby?" Svasht did not answer. He took the man's left hand in his own 2 hands and asked the question that was troubling him. "When I touch you like this, aren't you being polluted?" The man laughed and shook his head. "Not at all, child. You are a human being and I am a human being. You can't pollute me. Don't listen to what people tell you." He took Svasht's hand and walked with him to the edge of the forest. The water buffaloes were still grazing peacefully. The man looked at Svasht and asked, "Do you tend these buffaloes? And that must be the grass you have cut for their dinner. What is your name? Is your house nearby?" Svasht offered Siddhartha an armful of kusa grass to use as a cushion. Svasht answered politely, "Yes, sir, I care for these 4 buffaloes and that 1 calf, And that is the grass I cut. My name is Svasht and I live on the other side of the river just beyond the village of Uravela. Please, sir, what is your name and where do you live? Can you tell me? The man answered kindly, certainly. My name is Siddhartha, and my home is far away, but at present I am living in this forest. Are you a hermit? Siddhartha nodded. Svasht knew that hermits were men who usually lived and meditated up in the mountains. Though they had just met and exchanged no more than a few words, Svasht felt a warm bond with his new friend. In Uravela, no one had ever treated him in so friendly a way or spoken to him with such warmth. A great happiness surged within him, and he wanted to somehow express his joy. If only he had some gift he could offer Siddhartha. But there was no penny in his pocket, not even a piece of sugar cane or rock candy. What could he offer? He had nothing, but he summoned the courage to say, Mister, I wish I had something to give you as a gift, but I have nothing. Siddhartha looked at Svasht and smiled. But you do. You have something I would like very much. I do? Siddhartha pointed to the pile of kusa grass. That grass you have cut for the buffaloes is soft and fragrant. If you could give me a few handfuls, I shall make a sitting cushion for my meditation beneath the tree. That would make me very happy. Svasht's eyes shone. He ran to the pile of grass, gathered a large bundle in his thin arms, and offered it to Siddhartha. I just cut this grass down by the river. Please accept it. I can easily cut more for the buffaloes. Siddhartha placed his hands together like a lotus bud and accepted the gift. He said, You are a very kind boy. I thank you. Go and cut some more grass for your buffaloes before it grows too late. If you have a chance, please come and see me tomorrow afternoon in the forest again. Young Svasht bowed his head in farewell and stood watching as Siddhartha disappeared back into the forest. Then he picked up his sickle and headed for the shore, his heart filled with the warmest of feelings. It was early autumn. The kusa grass was still soft and his sickle was newly sharpened. It wasn't long at all before Svasht had cut another large armful of kusa grass. Svasht led the buffaloes to Rambhu's home, guiding them to cross a shallow section of the Naranjara River. The calf was reluctant to leave the sweet grass along the shore and Svasht had to coax her along. The bushel of grass on his shoulder was not heavy and Svasht waded across the river together with the buffaloes.
Chapter 4. The Wounded Swan. Early the next morning, Svasht led his buffaloes to graze. By noon he had cut enough grass to fill 2 baskets. Svasht liked to let the buffaloes graze on the side of the river which bordered the forest. That way, when he finished gathering grass, he could stretch out in the cool breeze and not worry about the buffaloes wandering into someone's rice fields. He carried only his sickle, the tool by which he earned his living. Svasht opened the small fistful of rice Bala had wrapped in a banana leaf for his lunch, but as he was about to eat, his thoughts turned to Siddhartha. I could take this rice to the hermit, Siddhartha, he thought. Surely he won't find my rice too humble. Svasht wrapped the rice and, leaving the buffaloes at the forest's edge, followed the path to where he had met Siddhartha the day before. From a distance he saw his new friend sitting beneath the great pipala tree. But Siddhartha was not alone. Before him sat a girl just about Svasht's age, dressed in a fine white sari. There was food already placed before him, and Svasht stopped abruptly. But Siddhartha looked up and called to him, Svasht. He motioned for the boy to join them. The girl in the white sari looked up, and Svasht recognized her as someone he had often passed on the village road. As Svasht approached, she moved to her left to make a place for him, and Siddhartha gestured him to sit down. In front of Siddhartha was a banana leaf which held a fistful of rice and a small amount of sesame salt. Siddhartha divided the rice into 2 portions. Have you eaten yet, child? No, mister, I haven't. Well then, let's share this. Siddhartha handed Svasht half the rice and Svasht joined his palms together in thanks, but refused the rice. He took out his own humble rice and said, "I've also brought some." He opened his banana leaf to reveal coarse grains of brown rice, unlike the soft white grains on Siddhartha's leaf. He had no sesame salt. Siddhartha smiled at the two children and said, "Shall we put all our rice together and share it?" He took half the white rice, dipped it in sesame salt, and handed it to Spasht. Then he broke off half of Spasht's rice ball and began to eat it with obvious delight. Spasht felt awkward, but seeing Siddhartha's naturalness, he began to eat as well. "Your rice is so fragrant, Mr. Sujata brought it," answered Siddhartha. "So her name is Sujata," thought Spasht. She looked a bit older than Spasht, perhaps a year or two. Her large black eyes twinkled. Spasht stopped eating and said, "I've seen you before on the village road, but I didn't know your name was Sujata." "Yes, I'm the daughter of the village chief of Uravala. Your name is Spasht, isn't it? Teacher Siddhartha was just telling me about you," she said, adding gently, "Spasht, it is more correct to call a monk teacher than Mr. Spasht nodded. Siddhartha smiled. "Well then, I don't need to introduce you to. Do you know, children, why I eat in silence? These grains of rice and sesame are so precious. I like to eat silently so that I can appreciate them fully. Sujata, have you ever had a chance to taste brown rice? Even if you've already eaten, please taste a bit of Spasht's rice. It is quite delicious. Now then, we can eat together in silence, and when we've finished, I'll tell you a story." Siddhartha, Spasht, and Sujata shared a meal in mindfulness. Siddhartha broke off a piece of brown rice and handed it to Sujata. She joined her palms like a lotus and respectfully accepted it. The three of them ate quietly in the deep calm of the forest. When the rice and sesame were gone, Sujata gathered the banana leaves. She took a jug of fresh water from her side and poured some into the only cup she had brought. She lifted the cup to offer water to Siddhartha. He took it in his two hands and offered it to Spasht. Flustered, Spasht blurted, "Please, Teacher, please, you take the first drink." Siddhartha answered in a soft voice, "You drink first, child. I want you to have the first drink." Again he lifted and offered the cup to Spasht. Spasht felt confused but didn't know how to refuse such an unaccustomed honor. He joined his palms in thanks and took the cup. He drank all the water in one long gulp. He handed the cup back to Siddhartha. Siddhartha asked Sujata to pour a second cup. When it was full, he raised it to his lips and sipped the water slowly, with reverence and deep enjoyment. Sujata's eyes did not stray from Siddhartha and Spasht during this exchange. When Siddhartha finished drinking, he asked Sujata to pour a third cup. This one he offered to her. She put down the water jug, joined her palms, and accepted the cup of water. She lifted it to her lips and drank in slow, small sips, just as Siddhartha had done. She was aware that this was the first time she had ever drunk from the same cup as an untouchable. But Siddhartha was her teacher, and if he had done so, why shouldn't she? And she noticed that she had no feeling whatsoever of being polluted. Spontaneously, she reached out and touched the buffalo boy's hair. It was such a surprise, Spasht didn't have a moment to move out of the way. Then Sujata finished drinking her water. She placed the empty cup on the ground and smiled at her two companions. Siddhartha nodded. "You children have understood. People are not born with caste. Everyone's tears are salty, and if everyone's blood is red. It is wrong to divide people into castes and create division and prejudice among them. This has become very clear to me during my meditation." Sujata looked thoughtful and she spoke, "We are your disciples and we believe your teaching. But there does not seem to be anyone else like you in this world. Everyone else believes that the sudras and the untouchables came forth from the Creator's feet. Even The scriptures say so. No one dares to think differently. Yes, I know. But the truth is the truth whether anyone believes it or not. Though a million people may believe a lie, it is still a lie. You must have great courage to live according to the truth. Let me tell you a story about when I was a boy. One day, when I was 9 years old and strolling alone in the garden, a swan suddenly dropped from the sky and writhed on the ground in front of me in great pain. I ran to pick it up, and I discovered that an arrow had deeply penetrated one of its wings. I clasped my hand firmly around the arrow's shaft and yanked it out, and the bird cried as blood oozed from its wound. I applied pressure to the wound with my finger to stop the bleeding, and took the bird inside the palace to find Princess Sundari, the lady-in-waiting. She agreed to pick a handful of medicinal leaves and make a poultice for the bird's wound. The swan shivered, so I took off my jacket and wrapped it around her. Then I placed her close to the royal fireplace. Siddhartha paused for a moment to look at Svasht. Svasht, I did not tell you yet, but when I was young I was a prince, the son of King Suddhodana in the city of Kapalavathu. Sujata knows this already. I was about to go find some rice for the swan when my 8-year-old cousin, Devdatta, burst into the room. He was clutching his bow and arrows, and he asked excitedly, Siddhartha, did you see a white swan fall down near here? Before I could answer, Devdatta saw the swan resting by the fireplace. He ran towards it, but I stopped him. You may not take the bird. My cousin protested, that bird is mine. I shot it myself. I stood between Devdatta and the swan, determined not to let him have it. I told him, this bird is wounded. I'm protecting it. It needs to stay here. Devdatta was quite stubborn and not about to give in. He argued, now listen, cousin, when this bird was flying in the sky, it didn't belong to anyone. As I'm the one who shot it out of the sky, it rightfully belongs to me. His argument sounded logical, but his words made me angry. I knew there was something wrong with his reasoning, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. So I just stood there, speechless, becoming more upset. I felt like punching him. Why I didn't, I don't know. Then, I saw a way to answer him. Listen, cousin, I told him, those who love each other live together, and those who are enemies live apart. You tried to kill the swan, so you and she are enemies. The bird cannot live with you. I saved her, bandaged her wound, warmed her, and was on my way to find food for her when you arrived. The bird and I love each other, and we can live together. The bird needs me, not you. Sujata clapped her hands together, that's right. You were right. Siddhartha looked at Svasht. And what do you think, child, of my statement? Svasht thought for a moment and then answered slowly, I think you are right. But not many people would agree. Most people would side with Devdatta. Siddhartha nodded. You are right. Most people do follow Devdatta's view. Let me tell you what happened next. As we couldn't agree on our own, we decided to take our concern to the adults. That day there was a meeting of the government in the palace, so we scurried to the Hall of Justice, where they were meeting. I held the swan and Devdatta clasped his bow and arrows. We presented our problem to the ministers and asked them to render judgment. The affairs of state came to a halt as the men listened, first to Devdatta and then to me. They discussed the matter at length, but they also were unable to agree. The majority seemed to be leaning towards Devdatta, when my father, the king, suddenly cleared his throat and coughed a few times. All the ministers suddenly stopped speaking and, tell me if you don't think this is odd, with total accord, they agreed that my argument was correct and that the bird should be given to me. Devdatta was beside himself with anger, but of course, there was nothing he could do. I had the bird, but I wasn't really happy. Even though I was still young, I knew that my victory had been less than honorable. I was given the bird because the ministers wanted to please my father, not because they saw the truth of what I said. That's sad, Sujata said and frowned. Yes, it was. But turning my thoughts to the bird, I took comfort in the fact that she was safe. Otherwise, she surely would have ended up in a cooking pot. In this world, few people look with the eyes of compassion, and so we are cruel and merciless toward each other. The weak are always oppressed by the strong. I still see that my reasoning that day was correct, for it arose from love and understanding. Love and understanding can ease the suffering of all beings. The truth is the truth, whether or not it is accepted by the majority. Therefore, I tell you children, it takes great courage to stand up for and protect what is right. What happened to the swan, teacher? Asked Sujata. For 4 days, I cared for her. When I saw that her wound had healed, I released her, after warning her to fly far away lest she be shot again. Siddhartha looked at the two children, their faces quiet and serious. Sujata, you must return home before your mother begins to worry. Spasht, isn't it time for you to return to your buffaloes and cut more grass? The armful of kuza grass you gave me yesterday made a perfect cushion for meditation. Last night and this morning, I sat upon it and my meditation was very peaceful. I saw many things clearly. You have been a great help, Spasht. As my understanding deepens, I shall share the fruit of my meditation with both you children. Now I will continue sitting. Spasht looked down at the grass which Siddhartha had shaped into a cushion. Though the grasses were packed firm, Spasht knew they were still fragrant and soft. He would bring his teacher a fresh armful of grass every 3 days to make a new cushion. Spasht stood up and, with Sujata, joined his palms and bowed to Siddhartha. Sujata set out for home and Spasht led his buffaloes to graze further along the riverbank.
Chapter 5. A bowl of milk. Every day Spasht went into the forest to visit Siddhartha. When he was able to cut 2 bundles of grass by midday, he had lunch with Siddhartha. But as the dry season continued and fresh grass became more and more scarce, it was often late afternoon before he could visit his friend and teacher. Sometimes when Spasht arrived, Siddhartha was sitting in meditation, and the boy sat silently for a brief moment, and then left the forest, not wanting to disturb his teacher's meditation. But when he found Siddhartha walking slowly along the forest path, he joined him, sometimes sharing simple conversation. Spasht also met Sujata frequently in the forest. Every day, she brought Siddhartha a rice ball with 1 condiment, such as sesame salt, peanuts, or a bit of curry. She also brought him milk or rice porridge or rock candy. The children had many occasions to talk with each other at the edge of the forest while the buffalo grazed. Sometimes Sujata brought her friend Supriya, a young girl Spasht's age. Spasht wanted to bring his brother and sisters to meet Siddhartha. He was sure they could cross the river at its most shallow point without difficulty. Sujata told Spasht how she first met Siddhartha several months earlier, and how she had since brought him food every day around noon. It was on a full moon day. At her mother's request, she had put on a new pink sari and carried a platter of food to offer to the forest gods. There were cakes, milk, congee, and honey. The noon sun blazed. As Sujata neared the river, she saw a man lying unconscious on the road. She put down her platter and ran to him. He was barely breathing and his eyes were tightly closed. His cheeks had the sunken look of someone who had not had food for a long time. From his long hair, tangled beard, and ragged garment, Sujata knew he was a mountain ascetic who must have fainted from hunger. Without hesitating, she poured a cup of milk and eased it against the man's lips, spilling a few drops on them. At first he did not respond, but then his lips quivered and parted slightly. Sujata slowly poured milk into his mouth. He began to drink and before long the cup was empty. "Child, please pour me a little more milk." Sujata then sat along the riverbank to see if the man would regain consciousness. Slowly he sat up and opened his eyes. Seeing Sujata, he smiled. He pulled the end of his garment back up over his shoulder and folded his legs in a lotus position. He began to breathe, first shallowly and then more deeply. His sitting was stable and beautiful. Thinking that he must be a mountain god, Sujata joined her palms and began to prostrate herself before him, but the man motioned for her to stop. Sujata sat up, and the man spoke to her in a soft voice, "Child, please pour me a little more milk." Happy to hear him speak, Sujata poured another cup and he drank it all. He felt how truly nourishing it was. Less than an hour before, he thought he was about to breathe his last. Now his eyes shone and he smiled gently. Sujata asked him how he had fainted on the road. "I have been practicing meditation in the mountains. Harsh ascetic discipline has left my body weak, so today I decided to walk down to the village to beg for some food. But I lost all my strength getting here. Thanks to you, my life has been saved." They sat along the riverbank together and the man told Sujata about himself. He was Siddhartha, the son of a king who reigned over the country of the Sakya clan. Sujata listened carefully as Siddhartha told her, "I have seen that abusing the body cannot help one to find peace or understanding. The body is not just an instrument. It is the temple of the spirit, the raft by which we cross to the other shore. I will no longer practice self-mortification. I will go into the village each morning to beg for food." Sujata joined her palms. "Honorable hermit, if you allow me, I will bring you food each day. There is no need for you to interrupt your meditation practice. My home is not far from here, and I know my parents would be happy for me to bring you your meal." Siddhartha was silent for a moment. Then he answered, "I am glad to accept your offer. But from time to time, I would also like to go into the village to beg in order to meet the villagers. I would like to meet your parents and other children in the village as well." Sujata was very happy. She joined her palms and bowed in gratitude. The thought of Siddhartha visiting her home and meeting her parents was wonderful. She knew, too, that bringing him food every day would be no hardship, as her family was one of the wealthiest in the village. She did not mention this to Siddhartha. She only understood that this monk was important and that offering food to him was more beneficial than making a dozen offerings to the forest gods. If Siddhartha's meditation deepened, she felt, his love and understanding could help relieve much suffering in the world. Siddhartha pointed out the Dhangsiri mountain where he had lived in the caves. "Beginning today, I will not return there. This forest is cool and refreshing. There is a magnificent pipala tree which I shall make the place of my practice. Tomorrow when you come with a food offering, please bring it there. Come, I will show you the spot." Siddhartha led Sujata across the river into the cool forest that bordered the other bank of the Naranhara river. He showed her the pipala tree under which he would meditate. Sujata admired its massive trunk and raised her head to gaze at the leafy branches which spread out like an enormous canopy. It was a kind of banyan tree with leaves shaped like hearts with long pointed tails. The leaves were as big as Sujata's hand. She listened to the birds chirping happily among the branches. It was a truly peaceful and refreshing spot. In fact, she had been to this tree before with her parents to make food offerings to the forest gods. "This is your new home, teacher." Sujata looked at Siddhartha with her round black eyes. "I will visit you here every day." Siddhartha nodded. He walked Sujata back out of the forest and said goodbye to her at the riverbank. Then he returned alone to the pipala tree. From that day on, Sujata brought rice or chapatis to offer to the monk, just before the sun began to cast shadows. Sometimes she also brought milk or kanji. Once in a while, Siddhartha would carry his begging bowl into the village. He met Sujata's father, the village chief, and her mother, who was wearing a beautiful yellow sari. Sujata introduced him to other children in the village and took him to the barber so he could have his head and beard shaved. Siddhartha's health recovered rapidly, and he told Sujata that his meditation practice was beginning to bear fruit. Then came the day that Sujata met Svasht. That day Sujata had come early. She listened as Siddhartha told her about meeting Svasht the day before. She had just said that she wished to meet Svasht herself when he appeared. Afterward, whenever she met Svasht, she never forgot to ask about his family. She and her servant, Purna, even went to visit Svasht's hut. Purna was hired to work in Sujata's household when her predecessor, Radha, died of typhoid fever. On these visits, Sujata brought used clothes still full of good wear for Svasht's family to use. And much to Purna's surprise, Sujata lifted baby Bhima in her arms. Afterwards, she cautioned Purna not to tell her parents that she had held an untouchable child. One day, a number of children decided to go and visit Siddhartha together. All of Svasht's family came. Sujata brought her girlfriends Balagupta, Vihaya Sanya, Olavalike, and Yatilika. She also invited her 16-year-old cousin Nandabala, who brought her younger brothers Nalaka, who was 14, and Subhash, who was 9. 11 children sat in a semicircle around Siddhartha, and they ate lunch together in silence. Svasht had instructed Bala and Rupak beforehand how to eat with quiet dignity. Even baby Bhima, sitting on Svasht's lap, ate without making a sound, her eyes open wide. Svasht brought a new armful of fresh grass for Siddhartha. He had asked his friend Gavampati, also a buffalo boy, to watch over Mr. Rampu's buffaloes so that he could have lunch with Siddhartha. In the fields, the sun blazed, but within the forest, Siddhartha and the children were refreshed by the cool shade of the pipala tree. Its leafy branches extended over an area wider than a dozen houses. The children shared their food with one another, and Rupak and Bala especially enjoyed chapati with curry and fragrant white rice dipped in peanuts and sesame salt. Sujata and Balagupta brought enough water for everyone to drink. Svasht's heart overflowed with happiness. The atmosphere was still and quiet, yet alive with the greatest joy. On that day, at Sujata's request, Siddhartha told them the story of his life. The children listened enraptured from beginning to end.
Chapter 6. Beneath a rose apple tree. When he was 9 years old, Siddhartha was told about the dream his mother had before giving birth to him. A magnificent white elephant with 6 tusks descended from the heavens surrounded by a chorus of beatific praises. The elephant approached her, its skin white as mountain snow. It held a brilliant pink lotus flower in its trunk and placed the flower within the queen's body. Then the elephant, too, entered her effortlessly, and all at once she was filled with deep ease and joy. She had the feeling she would never again know any suffering, worry, or pain, and she awoke uplifted by a sensation of pure bliss. When she got up from her bed, the ethereal music from the dream still echoed in her ears. She told her husband, the king, of the dream, and he, too, marveled at it. That morning, the king summoned all the holy men in the capital to come and divine the meaning of the queen's dream. After listening intently to the dream's content, they responded, "Your Majesty, the queen will give birth to a son who will be a great leader. He is destined to become either a mighty emperor who rules throughout the 4 directions, or a great teacher who will show the way of truth to all beings in heaven and earth. Our land, Your Majesty, has long awaited the appearance of such a great one." King Suddhodana beamed. After consulting the queen, he ordered that provisions from the royal storehouses be distributed to the ill and unfortunate throughout the land. Thus the citizens of the kingdom of Sakya shared the king and queen's joy over the news of their future son. Siddhartha's mother was named Mahamaya, a woman of great virtue. Her love extended to all beings, people, animals, and plants. It was the custom in those days for a woman to return to her parents' home to give birth there. Mahamaya was from the country of Kolia, so she set out for Ramagama, the capital of Kolia. Along the way, she stopped to rest in the garden of Lumbini. The forest there was filled with flowers and singing birds. Peacocks fanned their splendid tails in the morning light. Admiring an ashok tree in full bloom, the queen walked towards it, when suddenly, feeling unsteady, she grabbed a branch of the ashok tree to support her. Just a moment later, still holding the branch, Queen Mahamaya gave birth to a radiant son. The prince was bathed in fresh water and wrapped in yellow silk by Mahamaya's attendants. As there was no longer any need to return to Ramagama, the queen and the newborn prince were carried home in their four-horse carriage. When they arrived home, the prince was again bathed in warm water and placed next to his mother. Hearing the news, King Suddhodana hurried in to see his wife and son. His joy was boundless. His eyes sparkled and he named the prince Siddhartha, the one who accomplishes his aim. Everyone in the palace rejoiced, and one by one they came to offer their congratulations to the queen. King Suddhodana wasted no time in summoning the soothsayers to tell him of Siddhartha's future. After examining the baby's features, they all agreed that the boy bore the marks of a great leader and would no doubt rule over a mighty kingdom that spread in all four directions. 1 week later, a holy man named Asita Kaladevela paid a visit to the palace. His back was bent with age, and he needed a cane to descend the mountain where he lived. When the palace guards announced Master Asita's arrival, King Suddhodana personally came out to greet him. He ushered him in to see the baby prince. The holy man gazed at the prince for a long time without uttering a word. Then he began to weep, his trembling body supported by his cane. Streams of tears fell from his eyes. King Suddhodana's joy was boundless, as he hurried in to see his wife and newborn son. King Suddhodana grew alarmed and asked, "What is it? Do you forebode some misfortune for the child?" Master Asita wiped the tears with his hands and shook his head. "Your Majesty, I see no misfortune at all. I weep for myself, for I can clearly see that this child possesses true greatness. He will penetrate all the mysteries of the universe. Your Majesty, your son will not be a politician. He will be a great master of the way. Heaven and earth will be his home and all beings his relations. I weep because I will pass away before I have a chance to hear his voice proclaim the truths he will realize. Majesty, you and your country possess great merit to have given birth to such a one as this boy." Asita turned to leave. The king pleaded for him to stay, but it was of no use. The old man began walking back to his mountain. Master Asita's visit sent the king into a frenzy. He did not want his son to become a monk. He wanted him to assume his throne and extend the borders of their kingdom. The king thought, Asita is only one among hundreds, even thousands of holy men. Perhaps his prophecy is mistaken. Surely the other holy men who said Siddhartha would become a great emperor were correct. Clinging to this hope, the king was comforted. After having attained sublime joy giving birth to Siddhartha, Queen Mahamaya died 8 days later, and all the kingdom mourned her. King Suddhodana summoned her sister Mahapajapati and asked her to become the new queen. Mahapajapati, also known as Gautami, agreed, and she cared for Siddhartha as if he were her own son. As the boy grew older and asked about his real mother, he understood how much Gautami had loved her sister and how she more than anyone else in the world could love him as much as his own mother. Under Gautami's care, Siddhartha grew strong and healthy. One day, as Gautami watched Siddhartha play in the garden, she realized he was old enough to learn the graces of wearing gold and precious gems. She instructed her attendants to bring forth precious jewels to try on Siddhartha, but to her surprise, none rendered Siddhartha more handsome than he already was. As Siddhartha expressed discomfort at wearing such things, Gautami ordered the jewels to be returned to their cases. When Siddhartha reached school age, he studied literature, writing, music, and athletics with the other princes of the Sakya dynasty. Among his schoolmates were his cousins Devdatta and Kimbila and the son of a palace dignitary, a boy named Kaludai. Naturally intelligent, Siddhartha mastered his lessons quickly. His teacher Visvamita found the young Devdatta a sharp student, but never in his teaching career had he taught a student more impressive than Siddhartha. One day when he was 9 years old, Siddhartha and his schoolmates were allowed to attend the ritual first plowing of the fields. Gautami herself dressed Siddhartha right down to the fine slippers on his feet. Attired in his royal best, King Suddhodana presided over the ceremonies. High-ranking holy men and Brahmins paraded in robes and headdresses of every color imaginable. The ceremony was held next to the finest fields in the kingdom, not far from the palace itself. Flags and banners waved from every gate and along every roadside. Colorful displays of food and drink were laid out on altars crowded along the roads. Minstrels and musicians strolled among the throngs of people, adding mirth and merriment to the bustling festivities. Holy men chanted with utmost solemnity as Siddhartha's father and all the dignitaries of the court stood facing the unfolding ritual. Siddhartha stood towards the back with Devadatta and Kaludaya at his sides. The boys were excited because they had been told that when the rituals were over, everyone would enjoy a feast spread out on the grassy meadow. Siddhartha did not often go on picnics, and he was delighted. But the holy men's chanting went on and on what seemed like forever, and the young boys grew restless. Unable to endure any longer, they wandered off. Kaludaya held on to Siddhartha's sleeve, and off they went in the direction of the music and dancing. The hot sun blazed and the performers' costumes grew wet with perspiration. Beads of sweat shone on the dancing girls' foreheads. After running about among the scenes of entertainment, Siddhartha, too, grew hot and he left his friends to seek the shade of the rose apple tree alongside the road. Beneath the cool branches, Siddhartha felt pleasantly refreshed. At that moment, Gautami appeared and, spotting her son, she said, "I've been looking all over for you. Where have you been? You should return now for the conclusion of the ceremony. It would please your father." "Mother, the ceremony is too long. Why must the holy men chant so long?" "They are reciting the Vedas, my child. The scriptures have a profound meaning, handed down by the Creator himself to the Brahmins countless generations ago. You will study them soon. Why doesn't Father recite the scriptures instead of having the Brahmins do it? Only those born into the Brahmana caste are permitted to recite the scriptures, my child. Even kings who wield great power must depend on the services of the Brahmins for priestly duties." Siddhartha thought over Gautami's words. After a long pause, he joined his palms and entreated her, "Please, mother, ask father if I may stay here. I feel so happy sitting beneath this rose apple tree." Giving in good-naturedly to her child, Gautami smiled and nodded. She stroked his hair, and then returned down the path. At last the Brahmins concluded their prayers. King Suddhodana stepped down into the fields and, together with 2 military officers, began to plow the first row of the season, as cheers resounded among the crowd. Then the farmers followed the king's example and began to plow their fields. Hearing the people's cheers, Siddhartha ran to the edge of the fields. He watched a water buffalo straining to pull a heavy plow, followed by a robust farmer whose skin was bronze from long work in the sun. The farmer's left hand steadied the plow while his right hand wielded a whip to urge the buffalo on. Sun blazed and the man's sweat poured in streams from his body. The rich earth was divided into 2 neat furrows. As the plow turned the earth, Siddhartha noticed that the bodies of worms and other small creatures were being cut as well. As the worms writhed upon the ground, they were spotted by birds who flew down and grabbed them in their beaks. Then Siddhartha saw a large bird swoop down and grasp a small bird in its talons. Utterly absorbed in these events, standing beneath the burning sun, Siddhartha, too, became drenched in sweat. He ran back to the shade of the rose apple tree. He had just witnessed so many things strange and unknown to him. He sat cross-legged and closed his eyes to reflect on all he had seen. Composed and erect, He sat for a long time, oblivious to all the singing, dancing, and picnicking taking place around him. Siddhartha continued to sit, absorbed by the images of the field and the many creatures. When the king and queen passed by some time later, they discovered Siddhartha still sitting in deep concentration. Gautami was moved to tears seeing how beautiful Siddhartha looked, like a small, still statue. But King Suddhodana was seized with sudden apprehension. If Siddhartha could sit so solemnly at such a young age, might not the holy man Asita's prophecy come true? Too disturbed to remain for the picnic, the king returned alone to the palace in his royal carriage. Some poor, country children passed by the tree speaking and laughing happily. Gautami motioned them to be quiet. She pointed to Siddhartha sitting beneath the rose apple tree. Curious, the children stared at him. Suddenly, Siddhartha opened his eyes. Seeing the queen, he smiled. "Mother," he said, "reciting the scriptures does nothing to help the worms and the birds." Siddhartha stood up and ran to Gautami and clasped her hand. He then noticed the children observing him. They were about his own age, but their clothes were tattered, their faces soiled, and their arms and legs piteously thin. Aware of his princely attire, Siddhartha felt embarrassed, and yet he wanted very much to play with them. He smiled and hesitantly waved, and one boy smiled back. That was all the encouragement Siddhartha needed. He asked Gautami for permission to invite the children to the picnic feast. At first she hesitated, but then she nodded in assent.
Chapter 7 White Elephant Prize. When Siddhartha was 14 years old, Queen Gautami gave birth to a son, Nanda. All the palace rejoiced, including Siddhartha, who was very happy to have a younger brother. Every day after his studies, he ran home to visit Nanda. Although Siddhartha was already of an age to be concerned with other matters, he often took little Nanda on walks, accompanied by Devdatta. Siddhartha had 3 other cousins that he liked very much, named Manama, Bhatia, and Kimbila. He often invited them to play with him in the flower gardens behind the palace. Queen Gautami enjoyed watching them play as she sat on the wooden bench beside the lotus pond. Her attendant was always ready to respond to her request to bring drinks and snacks for the children. With each passing year, Siddhartha grew ever more adept in his studies and Devdatta had a hard time concealing his jealousy. Siddhartha mastered every subject with ease, including the martial arts. Although Devdatta was stronger, Siddhartha was more agile and alert. In math, the other boys yielded to Siddhartha's brilliance. Arjuna, his math teacher, spent hours answering Siddhartha's advanced questions. Siddhartha was especially gifted in music. His music teacher gave him a rare and precious flute, and on summer evenings Siddhartha would sit alone in the garden and play his new instrument. Sometimes his songs were sweet and soft, while other times the sound was so sublime that listeners felt as though they were being carried high above the clouds. Gautami often sat outside as the evening shadows fell in order to listen to her son's music. She experienced deep contentment as she allowed her heart to drift with the sound of Siddhartha's flute. As befitted his age, Siddhartha concentrated more intensely in his religious and philosophical studies. He was instructed in all the Vedas, and he pondered the meanings of the teachings and beliefs they expounded. He devoted special study to the Rigveda and Atharvaveda scriptures. From the time he was very small, Siddhartha had seen the Brahmins recite scriptures and perform rituals. Now he himself began to penetrate the subject matter contained in these sacred teachings. Great importance was given to the sacred writings of Brahmanism. The words and the sounds themselves were seen to hold great power, which could influence and even change the affairs of people in the natural world. The positions of the stars and the unfolding of the seasons were intimately connected to prayers and ritual offerings. The Brahmins were the sole ones regarded capable of understanding the hidden mysteries of heaven and earth, and they alone could use prayer and ritual to bring proper order to the realms of humans and the natural world. Siddhartha was taught that the cosmos emanated from a supreme being known as Purusa or Brahman, and that all castes in society had issued from various parts of the Creator's body. Every person contained part of the essence of the transcendental Creator, and that universal essence comprised a person's basic nature or soul. Siddhartha devoted serious study, as well, to all the other Brahmana texts, including the Brahmanas and the Upanishads. His teachers wanted only to instruct their charges in the traditional beliefs, but Siddhartha and his companions insisted on asking questions that forced their teachers to address contemporary ideas that did not always seem to accord with tradition. On the days the boys were off from school, Siddhartha persuaded them to visit and discuss these matters with well-known priests and Brahmins in the capital. Thanks to these encounters, Siddhartha learned that there were a number of movements in the country which openly challenged the absolute authority of the Brahmins. Members of these movements were not only discontented laymen who wished to share some of the power that had long belonged exclusively to the Brahmana caste, but they included reform-minded members of the Brahmana caste as well. Since the day young Siddhartha had been given permission to invite a few poor country children to his royal picnic, he had also been allowed to visit from time to time the small villages that surrounded the capital. On these occasions, he was always careful to wear only simple garments. By speaking directly with the people, Siddhartha learned many things that he had never been exposed to in the palace. He was aware, of course, that the people served and worshipped the three deities of Brahmanism, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. But he also learned that they were manipulated and oppressed by the Brahmana priests. In order to have the proper rituals for births, marriages, and funerals, families were forced to pay the Brahmins in food, money, and physical labor, regardless of how impoverished they were. One day while passing a straw hut, Siddhartha was startled by mournful cries from within. He asked Devdatta to enter and inquire what was the matter. They learned that the head of the household had recently died. The family was wretchedly poor. The wife and children were piteously thin and dressed in tattered rags. Their house was on the verge of collapse. Siddhartha learned that the husband had desired the services of a Brahman to purify the earth before rebuilding their kitchen, but before providing these services, the Brahman demanded the man work for him. Throughout several days the Brahman had ordered him to haul large rocks and chop wood. During this time the man became ill and the Brahman permitted him to return home, but halfway home, the man collapsed on the road and died. As a result of his own reflections, Siddhartha began to question some of the fundamental teachings of Brahmanism, that the Vedas had been given exclusively to the Brahmana caste, that Brahma was the supreme ruler of the universe, and that prayers and rituals of themselves possessed omnipotent power. Siddhartha sympathized with those priests and Brahmins who dared to directly challenge these dogmas. His interest never waned, and Siddhartha never missed a class or discussion on the Vedas. He also pursued the studies of language and history. Siddhartha liked very much to meet and discuss with hermits and monks, but as his father disapproved, he had to find excuses to go on other excursions in the hope of encountering such men. These monks cared nothing for material possessions and social status, unlike the Brahmins who openly vied for power. Rather, these monks abandoned everything in order to seek liberation and to cut the ties that bound them to the sorrows and worries of the world. They were men who had studied and penetrated the meaning of the Vedas and the Upanishads. Siddhartha knew that many such hermits lived in Kosala, the neighboring kingdom to the west, and in Magadha, which lay to the south. Siddhartha hoped that one day he would have a chance to visit these regions and study seriously with men such as these. Of course, King Suddhodana was aware of Siddhartha's aspirations. He dreaded that his son might one day leave the palace and become a monk, and he confided his worries to his younger brother, Dronadena, the father of Devdatta and Ananda. The country of Kosala has long had its eye on our territory. We must count on the talents of our young people, such as Siddhartha and Devdatta, to protect the destiny of our country. I greatly fear Siddhartha may decide to become a monk, as the master Asita Kaladevela predicted. If this comes to pass, it is likely that Devdatta will follow in Siddhartha's footsteps. Do you know how much they like to go out and meet with these hermits? Dronadena was taken aback by the king's words. After pondering a moment, he whispered in the king's ear, "If you ask me, I think you should find a wife for Siddhartha. Once he has a family to occupy him, he will abandon this desire to become a monk. King Suddhodana nodded. That night he confided his concerns to Gautami, who promised she would arrange for Siddhartha to marry in the near future, even though she had just recently given birth to a girl, a princess named Sundari Nanda. Soon after, she began to organize a number of gatherings for the young people in the kingdom. Siddhartha joined these evenings of music, athletic events, and field trips with enthusiasm. He made many new friends, both young men and young women. King Suddhodana had a younger sister named Pamita whose husband was King Dandapani of Kolia. The couple kept residences in both Ramagama, the capital of Kolia, and in Kapalavathu. Sakya and Kolia were separated only by the Rohini River and their peoples had been close for many generations. Their capitals were but a day's journey apart. At Gautami's request, the king and queen of Kolia agreed to organize a martial arts competition on the large field that bordered Canal Lake. King Suddhodana personally presided over the event to encourage the young people of his kingdom to develop their strength and increase their fighting skills. All the young people of the capital were invited to attend, girls as well as boys. The young women did not engage in the athletic contests but encouraged the young men with their praise and applause. Yasodhara, the daughter of Queen Pamita and King Dandapani, was responsible for welcoming all the guests. She was a lovely and charming young woman, her beauty natural and fresh. Siddhartha placed number 1 in all the events, including archery, swordsmanship, horse racing, and weightlifting, and it was Yasodhara who presented him with his prize, a white elephant. With her palms joined and her head slightly bowed, in a voice noble and serene, she declared, "Please accept this elephant, Prince Siddhartha, for your well-deserved victory. And please accept my heartfelt congratulations." Siddhartha placed number 1 in all the events. Yasodhara presented him with his prize, a white elephant. The princess' movements were graceful and unaffected, and her manner of dress elegant and refined. Her smile was as fresh as a half-opened lotus. Siddhartha bowed and looked into her eyes, saying in a quiet voice, "Thank you, princess." Devdatta stood behind Siddhartha, unhappy to have won only second place. Upset that Yasodhara had not even noticed him, he grabbed the elephant's trunk and viciously struck it in a sensitive spot. Overcome with pain, the elephant dropped to its knees. Siddhartha looked severely at Devdatta. "Cousin, that was outrageous." Siddhartha rubbed the tender place on the elephant's trunk and spoke soothingly to it. Gradually the elephant stood up again and bowed its head in respect to the prince. The spectators applauded loudly. Siddhartha climbed upon the elephant's back and the victory procession began. Under the guidance of its trainer, the white elephant carried Siddhartha around the capital of Kapalavathu, and the people cheered. Yasodhara walked beside them with slow, graceful steps.
Chapter 8. The Jeweled Necklace. As he grew into his teens, Siddhartha came to find palace life stifling, so he began making excursions beyond the city limits to see what life was like outside. He was always accompanied by Channa, his faithful attendant, and sometimes also by his friends or brothers. Channa was responsible for Siddhartha's horse carriage, and he and Siddhartha took turns holding the reins. As Siddhartha never used a whip, Channa did not either. Siddhartha visited every corner of the Sakya kingdom, from the rugged foothills of the Himalayan mountains in the north to the great southern plains. The capital, Kapalavathu, was located in the richest, most populated region of the lowlands. Compared with the neighboring kingdoms of Kosala and Magadha, Sakya was quite small, but what it lacked in area it more than made up in its ideal location. The Rohini and Banganga rivers, which began in the highlands, flowed down to irrigate its rich plains. They continued southwards and joined the Hiranyavati River before emptying into the Ganga. Siddhartha loved to sit on the banks of the Banganga and watch the water rush by. The local villagers believed that the waters of the Banganga could wash away one's bad karma, from both present and past lives, and so they often submerged themselves in the water, even at near freezing temperatures. One day, while sitting along the riverbank with his attendant, Siddhartha asked, Channa, do you believe this river can wash away bad karma? It must, Your Highness, otherwise why would so many people come here to wash themselves? Siddhartha smiled. Well then, the shrimp, fish, and oysters who spend their entire lives in these waters must be the purest and most virtuous beings of all. Channa replied, Well, at least I can say that bathing in this river will wash away the dirt and dust from one's body. Siddhartha laughed and patted Channa on the shoulder. With that, I certainly agree. On another day, as he was returning to the palace, Siddhartha was surprised to see Yasodhara in a small, poor village, with one of her maidservants, tending to the village children who were suffering from eye diseases, influenza, skin disorders, and other ailments. Yasodhara was dressed simply, yet she appeared to be as a goddess who had appeared among the poor. Siddhartha was deeply moved to see the daughter of a royal family placing her own comfort aside so that she could care for the destitute. She rinsed their infected eyes and skin, dispensed medicine, and washed their soiled clothes. Princess, how long have you been doing this? Asked Siddhartha. It is beautiful to see you here. Yasodhara looked up from washing a little girl's arm. For almost 2 years, Your Highness. But this is only the second time I have been in this village. I often stop here. The children know me well. Your work must give you a great feeling of satisfaction, Princess. Yasodhara smiled without answering. She bent over to continue washing the girl's arm. That day, Siddhartha had a chance to speak with Yasodhara for a longer time. He was surprised to learn that she shared many of his own ideas. Yasodhara was not content to remain in her lady's quarters blindly obeying tradition. She, too, had studied the Vedas and secretly opposed society's injustices. And like Siddhartha, she did not feel truly happy being a privileged member of a wealthy, royal family. She loathed the power struggles among the courtiers and even among the Brahmins. She knew that as a woman she could not effect great social change, so she found ways to express her convictions through charitable work. She hoped that her friends might see the value of this through her example. Siddhartha was deeply moved to see Yasodhara caring for the destitute child. Since the day he first saw her, Siddhartha had felt a special affinity for Yasodhara. Now he found himself drawn to every word she spoke. His father had expressed a desire that he marry soon. Perhaps Yasodhara was the right woman. During the musical and athletic gatherings, Siddhartha had met many charming young women, but Yasodhara was not only the most beautiful, she was the one with whom he felt ease and contentment. One day, Queen Gautami decided to organize a reception for all the young women of the capital. She asked Pamita, Yasodhara's mother, to help with the preparations. The young women of Kapilavatthu were invited, and each was to be presented with fine jewelry. Queen Pamita suggested that Siddhartha himself present each gift, much in the same spirit that Yasodhara had welcomed the guests that attended the martial arts contest. King Suddhodana and the members of the royal family would be present. The party took place on a delightfully cool evening. Food and drinks were set out throughout the palace halls, while musicians entertained the guests. Beneath the bright, flickering lights of flowered lanterns, graceful young women arrived, wearing colorful saris shimmering with gold thread. One by one they passed before the royal dignitaries, including the king and queen. Siddhartha, dressed in princely garb, stood to the left behind a table covered with pearl necklaces and gold and precious gems to present to nearly 1,000 young ladies. At first Siddhartha had refused to present the gifts personally, but Gautami and Pamita had beseeched him. It would be a great honor and happiness for any person to receive a gift directly from you. You should understand that, said Pamita with a convincing smile. Siddhartha did not want to refuse to provide happiness to others, and so he complied. But now, standing before the thousands of guests, Siddhartha did not know how he could possibly choose a fitting gift for each lady. Every young woman passed in full view of all the guests before approaching Siddhartha. The first young woman to be presented was Soma, daughter of a prince. As instructed by Pamita, she mounted the stairs of the royal dais, stopped to bow to the king and queen and all the distinguished guests, and then walked slowly towards Siddhartha. When she reached him, she bowed her head, and Siddhartha bowed in return. Then he offered her a strand of jade beads. The guests applauded their approval, and Soma bowed. She spoke her thanks so softly that Siddhartha could not understand her words. The next woman was Rohini, named after the river. Siddhartha did not try to distinguish among the young women by selecting different jewels to match their particular grace and beauty. He picked up whichever ornament was next on the table and offered it to the next young woman. Thus the presentation of gifts proceeded quickly even though there were so many young women. By 10 at night, most of the jewelry had been given away. Everyone believed a young woman named Sela was the last in line. But just as Siddhartha thought he had completed his task, another young woman appeared from the audience and slowly made her way to the dais. It was Yasodhara. She was dressed in an ivory-colored sari as simple and light as a cool morning breeze. She bowed to the king and queen. Ever graceful and natural, she approached Siddhartha, smiled, and asked, "Does your highness have anything left for me?" Siddhartha looked at Yasodhara and then confusedly at the ornaments remaining on the table. He appeared flustered. There was nothing on the table worthy of Yasodhara's beauty. Suddenly he smiled. He removed the necklace around his own neck and held it out too. "Yasodhara, this is my gift to you, princess." Yasodhara shook her head. "I came here to honor you. How can I take away your own necklace?" Siddhartha answered, "My mother, Queen Gautami, often says that I look better without jewelry. Please, princess, accept this gift." He motioned her to step closer so that he could place the shining beads around her neck. The guests burst into applause, and it seemed as if the cheers would never end. They all rose to their feet to express their joyous approval.
Chapter 9. The Path of Compassion. Siddhartha and Yasodhara's wedding took place the following autumn. It was an occasion of great joy and celebration for the entire kingdom. The capital, Kapilavatthu, was decked with flags, lanterns, and flowers, and there was music everywhere. Wherever Siddhartha and Yasodhara went in their carriage, they were greeted with resounding cheers. They also visited outlying hamlets and villages, bringing gifts of food and clothing to many poor families. King Suddhodana supervised the building of 3 palaces for the young couple, one for each season. The summer palace was built on a beautiful hillside in the highlands, while the rainy season and winter palaces were in the capital city. Each palace had lotus pools, some for pale blue lotuses, some for pink, and some for white. The couple's fine garments and slippers, and the fragrant sandalwood they lit every day, were ordered specially from Varanasi, the capital of the Kasi kingdom to the southwest. King Suddhodana was at peace, now that Siddhartha had followed the path he had wished his son to follow. He personally selected the finest musicians and dancers in the kingdom to provide continual and pleasant entertainment for his young son and daughter-in-law. But happiness for Siddhartha and Yasodhara was not to be found in a pampered life of wealth and status. Their happiness came from opening their hearts and sharing their deepest thoughts with each other. They weren't moved by exquisite and savory foods or fancy silken clothes. While they could appreciate the artistry of the dancers and musicians, they were not carried away by the pleasures they offered. They had their own dreams, to find answers concerning the spiritual quest and the renewal of society. Siddhartha and Yasodhara's wedding was an occasion of great joy and celebration for the entire kingdom. The following summer, as they were driven to their summer palace by faithful Channa, Siddhartha's boyhood attendant, Siddhartha introduced Yasodhara to places throughout the kingdom she did not yet know. They stayed several days at each location, sometimes spending the night in the homes of country folk, sharing their simple foods and sleeping upon their woven string beds. They learned a great deal about the way of life and the customs of each place they visited. At times they encountered terrible misery. They met families with 9 or 10 children, every child racked with disease. No matter how hard the parents toiled day and night, they could not earn enough to support so many children. Hardship went hand in hand with the life of the peasants. Siddhartha gazed at children with arms and legs as thin as matchsticks and bellies swollen from worms and malnutrition. He saw the handicapped and infirm forced to beg in the streets, and these scenes robbed him of any happiness. He saw people caught in inescapable conditions. In addition to poverty and disease, they were oppressed by the Brahmins, and there was no one to whom they could complain. The capital was too distant, and even if they went there, who would help them? He knew that even a king had no power to change the situation. Siddhartha had long understood the inner workings of the royal court. Every official was intent on protecting and fortifying his own power, not on alleviating the suffering of those in need. He had seen the powerful plot against each other, and he felt nothing but revulsion for politics. He knew that even his own father's authority was fragile and restricted. A king did not possess true freedom but was imprisoned by his position. His father was aware of many officials' greed and corruption, but was forced to rely on these same individuals to maintain the stability of his reign. Siddhartha realized that if he stood in his father's place, he would have to do the same. He understood that only when people overcame greed and envy in their own hearts would conditions change. And so his desire to seek a path of spiritual liberation was reignited. Yasodhara was bright and intuitive. She understood Siddhartha's longings, and she had faith that if Siddhartha resolved to find the path of liberation he would succeed. But she was also quite practical. Such a search could last months, even years. In the meantime, sufferings would continue to daily unfold around them. And so she believed it was important to respond right in the present moment. She discussed with Siddhartha ways to ease the suffering of the poorest members of society. She had been doing work like that for several years, and her efforts eased some of the people's misery and brought some measure of peace and happiness to her own heart as well. She believed that with Siddhartha's loving support she could continue such work for a long time. From Kapalavathu came pouring all manner of goods and servants to provide for the couple's summer needs. Siddhartha and Yasodhara sent home most of the servants, retaining only a few to assist them with the gardens, cooking, and housekeeping. And, of course, they retained the services of Channa. Yasodhara organized their daily life as simply as possible. She personally entered the kitchen to direct the cooking of simple meals pleasing to Siddhartha, and she cared for his garments with her own hands. She sought Siddhartha's guidance concerning the relief projects she intended to continue when they returned to the capital. Siddhartha understood her need to engage in social action, and he never failed to express his support. Because of this, Yasodhara placed even deeper trust in her husband. But although Siddhartha understood the value of Yasodhara's work, he felt that her path alone could not bring true peace. People were entrapped not only by illness and unjust social conditions, but by the sorrows and passions they themselves created in their own hearts and minds. And if in time, Yasodhara fell victim to fear, anger, bitterness, or disappointment, where would she find the energy needed to continue her work? Siddhartha had himself experienced suspicion, frustration, and pain when he saw how things worked in the palace and in society. He knew that the attainment of inner peace would be the only basis for true social work, but he did not confide these thoughts to Yasodhara, because he feared that they would only cause her uncertainty and worry. When the couple returned to their winter palace, they entertained a constant stream of guests. Yasodhara welcomed family members and friends with great warmth and respect, but she was most attentive when Siddhartha spoke with them about philosophy and religion and their relation to politics and society. Even while going back and forth to direct the servants, Yasodhara never missed a word of these conversations. She had hoped to discover among their friends some who might like to join her work for the poor, but few expressed interest in such pursuits. Most were more interested in feasting and having a good time. Yet Siddhartha and Yasodhara patiently received them all. In addition to Siddhartha, there was one other person who understood and wholeheartedly supported Yasodhara's efforts, Gautami, the Queen Mahapajapati. The queen was most attentive to her daughter-in-law's happiness, for she knew that if Yasodhara was happy, Siddhartha would be happy as well. But that was not the sole reason she supported Yasodhara's good work. Gautami was a woman of compassion, and from the first time she accompanied Yasodhara on a visit to a poor village, she understood at once the true value of Yasodhara's work. It was not just the material goods given to the poor, such as rice, flour, cloth, and medicine, but the kind glances, helping hands, and loving heart of one willing to respond directly to those who suffer. Queen Mahapajapati was not like other women in the palace. She frequently told Yasodhara that women possessed as much wisdom and strength as men and needed to shoulder the responsibilities of society also. While women did possess a special ability to create warmth and happiness in their families, there was no reason for them to remain only in the kitchen or in the palace. Gautami found in her daughter-in-law a woman with whom she could share true friendship, for like herself, Yasodhara was thoughtful and independent. Not only did the queen offer Yasodhara her approval, but she worked alongside Yasodhara as well.
Chapter 10. Unborn Child. During this time, King Suddhodana expressed the desire to have Siddhartha spend more time at his side so that he could instruct his son in political and courtly affairs. The prince was invited to attend many official meetings, sometimes alone with the king, at other times with the king's court. Siddhartha gave his full attention to these affairs, and he came to understand that the political, economic, and military problems that beset any kingdom had their roots in the selfish ambitions of those involved in politics. Concerned only with protecting their own power, it was impossible for them to create enlightened policies for the common good. When Siddhartha saw corrupt officials feign virtue and morality, anger filled his heart. But he concealed it, as he did not have any alternatives to offer. "Why don't you contribute ideas at court instead of always sitting so silently?" King Suddhodana asked one day after a long meeting with several officials. Siddhartha looked at his father. "It is not that I haven't ideas, but it would be useless to state them. They only point to the disease. I do not yet see a cure for the selfish ambitions of those in the court. Look at Vesamita, for example. He holds an impressive amount of power at court, yet you know he is corrupt. More than once he has tried to encroach upon your authority, but you are still forced to depend on his services. Why? Because you know if you don't, chaos will break loose." King Suddhodana looked at his son silently for a long moment. Then he spoke. "Siddhartha, you know well that in order to maintain peace in one's family and country, there are certain things one must tolerate. My own power is limited, but I am sure that if you prepared yourself to be king, you would do far better than I have. You possess the talent needed to purge the ranks of corruption while preventing chaos in our homeland." Siddhartha sighed. "Father, I do not think it is a question of talent. I believe the fundamental problem is to liberate one's own heart and mind. I too am trapped by feelings of anger, jealousy, fear, and desire." Similar exchanges between father and son made King Suddhodana grow increasingly anxious. He recognized that Siddhartha was a person of unusual depth, and he saw how differently he and his son viewed the world. Still, he fostered the hope that over time, Siddhartha would come to accept his role and fill it in a most worthy way. In addition to his duties at court and assisting Yasodhara, Siddhartha continued to meet and study with well-known Brahmins and monks. He knew that the pursuit of religion was not just the study of the holy scriptures but included the practice of meditation to attain liberation for one's heart and mind, and he sought to learn more about meditation. He applied all that he learned in these studies to his own life in the palace, and he shared these insights with Yasodhara. "Gopa," Siddhartha liked to call Yasodhara affectionately, "perhaps you should also practice meditation. It will bring peace to your heart and enable you to continue your work for a long time. Yasodhara followed his advice. No matter how busy her work kept her, she reserved time for meditation. Husband and wife often sat together silently. At such times, their attendants left them alone, and the couple asked their musicians and dancers to go perform elsewhere. Husband and wife often sat together silently. From the time he was small, Siddhartha had been taught the 4 stages of Abraham's life. In youth, Abraham studied the Vedas. In the 2nd stage, he married, raised a family, and served society. In the 3rd stage, when his children were grown, he could retire and devote himself to religious studies. And in the 4th stage, released from every tie and obligation, Abraham could live the life of a monk. Siddhartha thought about it and concluded that by the time one was old, it would be too late to study the way. He did not want to wait that long. Why can't a person live all 4 ways at once? Why can't a man pursue a religious life while he still has a family? Siddhartha wanted to study and practice the way in the very midst of his present life. Of course, he could not refrain from thinking about famous teachers in distant places such as Satyabhai or Rajagaha. He was sure that if he could find a way to study with such masters, he would make much more progress. The monks and teachers he frequently met had all mentioned the names of certain great masters such as Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta. Everyone aspired to study with such masters, and each day, Siddhartha felt his own desire grow ever more urgent. One afternoon Yasodhara came home, her face filled with grief. She did not speak to anyone. A young child she had tended for more than a week had just died. Despite all her efforts, she could not rescue the child from death's grasp. Overcome with sadness, she sat in meditation while tears streamed down her cheeks. It was impossible to hold back feelings. When Siddhartha returned from a meeting at court, she again burst into tears. Siddhartha held her in his arms and tried to console her. "Gopa, tomorrow I will go with you to the funeral. Cry now, it will lessen the pain in your heart. Birth, old age, sickness, and death are heavy burdens each of us carries in this life. What has happened to the child could happen to any of us at any moment." Yasodhara spoke between sobs. "Each day, I see how true all the things you have said are. My 2 hands are so small compared to the immensity of suffering. My heart is constantly filled with anxiety and sorrow. Oh, husband, please show me how I can overcome the suffering in my heart." Siddhartha embraced Yasodhara tightly in his arms. "My wife, I myself am seeking a path to overcome the suffering and anxiety in my own heart. I have seen into the situation of society and human beings, but despite all my efforts, I have not yet seen the way to liberation. Yet I feel sure that one day I will find a way for all of us. Gopa, please have faith in me. I have never been without faith in you, my darling. I know that once you have resolved to accomplish something, you will pursue it until you succeed. I know that one day you will leave all your wealth and privileges behind in order to seek the way. Only, please, my husband, do not leave me just now. I need you." Siddhartha raised Yasodhara's chin and looked into her eyes. No, I won't leave you now. Only when. Yasodhara placed her hand over Siddhartha's mouth. "Siddhartha, please say no more. I want to ask you something. If you were to have a child with me, would you want it to be a boy or a girl?" Siddhartha was startled. He looked carefully at Yasodhara. "What are you saying, Gopa? Do you mean, can you be?" Yasodhara nodded. She pointed to her belly and said, "I am so happy to be carrying the fruit of our love. I want it to be a boy who looks just like you, with your intelligence and kind virtue." Siddhartha put his arms around Yasodhara and held her close. In the midst of his great joy, he felt the seeds of worry. Still, he smiled and said, "I will be just as Happy if it is a boy or a girl, just so long as the baby has your compassion and wisdom. Gopa, have you told mother? You are the only one I have told. This evening, I will go to the main palace and tell Queen Gautami. At the same time, I will ask her advice on how best to care for our unborn child. Tomorrow I will go tell my own mother, Queen Pamita. I'm sure everyone will be very happy. Siddhartha nodded. He knew that his mother would pass the news on to his father as soon as she learned of it. The king would be overjoyed and would no doubt organize a great banquet to celebrate. Siddhartha felt the ties that bound him to life in the palace tightening.